Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to a very special episode we're recording with Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who was the 32nd Foreign Secretary of India, and he also served as the ambassador to Germany and China and as the High Commissioner to Malaysia. He retired from Indian Foreign Service in January 2020 after a diplomatic career that spanned 39 years. And we're going to talk about his first book, The Tiananmen Square, Making of a Protest. Thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, sir, before we move on to any detailed question, would you like to give a small overview of what the book is all about? So after that, we can go on to the questions.
Sure. So the book Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, is essentially a recounting, partly from an eyewitness, that was me, of course in hindsight, about what happened in Beijing in the summer of 1989. In one sense, that was a very major turning point in Chinese domestic politics. And it was covered extensively by the foreign media at the time. But subsequently, because the Cold War ended later that year and focus shifted back to Europe, the Tiananmen incident shifted back into the shadows. Nonetheless, it is a very relevant fact of Chinese politics even today, because the same political party, the Communist Party of China, continues to be the ruling party. And as we all know, China has now become much more powerful economically and militarily, much more influential in global affairs. And therefore, I felt it was important for Indians, particularly the younger generation, to know more about what is happening in China. Because for us in the next few years or few decades going forward, China will remain a challenge for India. Now, the real issue for me was whether to focus merely on those 50-odd days in the summer of 1989, or to give a broader overview of how China got to that point over a period of maybe a decade or so. And I opted for the latter course of action, which is to talk about China's political and economic situation from roughly 1978 or 1979 all the way to 1989 for two reasons. First, because it added context to what happened in Tiananmen in 1989. And secondly, because I believe this is the decade that firmly established China on the path to economic growth, which has, as we all know, now brought her to being the second largest economy and will likely be the largest economy by 2030. And the book is essentially at many levels. At one level, it is how the Chinese leadership took the decision to do economic reform when it was supposedly a communist government with an ideology which preached equality. The second, of course, was the politics inside the party. And the third was, of course, the popular discontent, which was expressed in terms of mainly students, but increasingly also union workers and even intellectuals about certain conditions that they felt needed to be improved in China. So in a nutshell, that's the book.
Yeah, and I want to go a couple of points in the background before we talk about the actual protest or what happened there. So you mentioned in the book, it's very relevant as well that the party leadership was very conflicted. There was a division within the party. And even we saw for the course of action as well of what the General Secretary that time, Zhao Jiang, want that time. For example, a more formal dialogue with the students, whereas the party elders that time wanted a more hard approach. So, and also we saw after the death of Hu Yaoming, what happened around this entire students protesting and came out, there were posters. So how that added to this entire movement as a context, you can tell us.
You know, one of the popular misconceptions we have as Indians is that the Communist Party is a monolithic party where one man, and I use the word man consciously because there are no women who have reached the top rung of the party so far, where one man decides the future of the entire party and the country. In fact, this is a myth, because if you look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party from 1921 onwards, you will see that it is basically the history of an almost constant struggle between various factions of the party, various ways of thinking. Now, in some cases, a particular way of thinking predominated. For instance, Mao Zedong was able to dominate the party between 1935 and 1960. And similarly done between 1978 and 1995. But even during these periods of domination, other opinions, other positions, other political forces existed within the party. And therefore, in one sense, it is important to understand this, not only when we look at China historically, but when we look at China today. Because if you ask an average Indian about China of today, she or he will tell you that Xi Jinping is the be-all and end-all, and there is no political difference, no opposition, and so on, which is not factually correct. Now, as far as the students were concerned, again, the point I made in the book was that there were genuine issues they were concerned with, mostly of an economic nature. The question of jobs or employment, the question of higher education and the difficulties of getting into good universities and colleges, the cost of housing, which was also rising, and food prices, because inflation was very high. But there were much less demands for political change in the way that the West would have liked. Therefore, this wasn't really a movement for democracy. It wasn't as if the students were leading the charge to have the Communist Party replaced by a multi-party parliamentary democracy as India has. It is true that there were some views expressed. It is only natural in a student body that there are some students which hold these views. But principally, it was a movement of economic discontent and a general desire by the students to have some improvements. Of course, the party factions used the students, used the mass movement that was developing, the discontent in society, to achieve their political ends. And that is really the story of Tiananmen.
Yeah. And so while I was reading the book, this one thought was coming to my mind, that a country where there is such a huge state surveillance, and the Communist Party where refers that it knows what's brewing and it knows, for example, what the students were doing that time. So, why did Deng Xiaoping took so much time to react? He didn't probably react till 1992. So why was there such a reaction time?
No, that's a good question. And the simple answer is that state surveillance is a tool. If you are united, the tool works because everybody in the party is united in ensuring that the party survives, and then the surveillance assists the party in squashing discontent elsewhere. But when the party itself is divided, the tool, it can be used by both sides, or the tool sometimes becomes inoperable because contending factions within the party neutralize each other. And that, in a sense, was what happened between 1987 and 1989. After all, Chao Ziyang was the general secretary of the party. At least nominally, he was numero uno in the party. Therefore, one would presume that he had sufficient power to control certain systems and at least to ensure that the surveillance was not of a nature which could prevent him from utilizing the students to achieve his objectives. So it actually shows us that even in a totalitarian state or an authoritarian state, things like surveillance or lack of democracy or lack of freedom of the press or lack of freedom of expression succeed only if that state is united. If the polity of the state fractures, then whether it is a democratic state or an authoritarian state, the tools of government don't function the way they are meant to, or the way they intend them to function.
Yeah, and in sort of a way, is this the story of, in the book that you mentioned of the Tiananmen Square, is also the story of Deng Xiaoping in some ways, because it also shows how he dealt with the situation, the crisis that time.
I think it is very much the story of Deng, not just the Tiananmen incident, but the 10 years that I cover between 1978 and 1990. And I say this for two reasons. First, because he showed leadership. In other words, he had a vision which said that we must take China into a modern era. And for that purpose, we must reform the policy of guaranteeing employment, housing, food, and so on, and allow competition to come into the market. Now, at the moment in the 21st century, for all of you, this is a norm. But in the Cold War, it required a great deal of political courage to do so. So the first thing that Deng stood out for was his vision. But equally, he stood out because of the courage of conviction that he displayed. We must remember that he was walking into uncharted territory. And essentially, it was a huge political risk. In a democracy, if the leadership makes mistakes, you might lose the next election, you might lose your job. In a dictatorship, if you make an error, you lose more than your job. You might lose your property, you might lose your freedom, and you might even lose your life. So it required courage of conviction. And he displayed this courage of conviction despite opposition and despite the fact that he had to sacrifice two of his own appointees. For that reason, I think Deng is the true maker of modern China. And this was the decade leading up to Tiananmen, when he actually set China on the rails. And really the train has run along those rails in the subsequent administrations of the three general secretaries who have followed him.
Yeah, and I want to come a little bit to your personal anecdote. You experienced it firsthand, and you were also. I was listening to one of the interviews. You mentioned that you were on the ground as well, talking to a lot of people, especially the students. Mm-hmm. So tell us about some personal anecdotes on the ground and how that actually shaped up the events that you mentioned in the book, because you also rightly mentioned there's one of the places I was reading that there's paucity of literature, especially written by Indians for Indians on China. And how does that come handy with your personal experience on ground?
So I was in the square very often actually in those 59 days, although I must confess that I was not there on the night of 3rd and 4th June because the situation was too dangerous. I don't include many personal anecdotes in the book because I did not want this to be a personal memoir. I wanted it to be a more researched and well-rounded understanding of what happened. And therefore, I only used information which I could substantiate through other means or citing of sources. But of course, personally, it was a very interesting time for us because in this authoritarian state where access was extremely limited, you suddenly got access to not only the students, but to a variety of people in the government, in the media, and in society. And for once, they were willing to speak their minds without the fear or concern that somebody was overhearing them and might report them. And in that process, one got a lot of insights. One was particularly interested in the posters that were put up. So you had very interesting posters comparing some of the Chinese leaders with Hitler, for instance, pictures of them with the Hitler moustache. You had a very nice poster, which I recall very distinctly, of Deng Xiaoping sitting on a Mercedes-Benz. At that time, the Mercedes-Benz car was the status symbol for the leadership in China, but almost nobody else could even own a vehicle. There were no cars on the road. So the poster said, sell the Benz and pay the debt. Because, of course, debt was high and inflation was high and people felt the economy was mismanaged. You had interesting comparisons between Deng Xiaoping and Napoleon Bonaparte, for instance. So you found this, in a sense, was a remarkable freedom of expression, which we take for granted in our country, because it happens every day with all of us in our conversations, in whatever presentations we make. We introduce humor, we introduce satire, we introduce criticism. But in China, this was not possible. And therefore, for us, it actually was a deep reflection into the way society thought and functioned. In the same way that in India, when we use humor or satire, it also reflects the way we think as Indians, or we think as individuals. So, in a sense, the personal experience lent a lot more in the story than if I had just written it as a research or academic exercise without being there. And therefore, the value of the book is actually in two ways. First, because I don't think there is any other Indian account which is quite so detailed. Secondly, because even globally or internationally, I don't recall many eyewitness accounts or substantially based eyewitness accounts of the incident. Many are written subsequently by scholars, and of course a few by journalists who were there. But from the governmental angle, or from an official angle, somebody who was a diplomat, I don't recall many third-party reports of this incident. So I guess for those two reasons, the book should be read.
Yeah, definitely. And moving on, actually, I want to talk a little bit about, since you mentioned that China was opening up that time, and recently there was a visit from Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. And in fact, he wanted to make sure the relations were stable and it did not affect what the visit actually, the purpose was meant for. So in a situation, you also mentioned that the embassy had a lot of people who were really experienced with China and knew and had expertise on the field. So how are you dealing with the ongoing situation? Because this is something probably not just a young diplomat, but also for this a lot of senior people who are experiencing first time. And especially one of the places I want to ask you, you mentioned about until there was this position where there was firing in the diplomatic area, there was a debate and discussion that was happening how to react. So tell us about this entire situation of what was the conversation going in the embassy that time.
Well, when it all began, as I explained, or perhaps I didn't, there were senior people in the embassy who had experience in dealing with such situations in the past. During the Cultural Revolution, when people also came out onto the street, although that was different because that was government sponsored, whereas this was anti-government. Both the ambassador at that time, the Indian ambassador, and the deputy chief of the mission, or the deputy ambassador, had been posted to China. So they immediately had a political sense and experience on what might happen. And therefore, they were able to marshal the rest of us. We were all much younger, and sort of tell us to go out and find out what was happening and talk to people. So, to that extent, I think experience counted. And as a result, perhaps the Indian embassy was better informed about the situation pretty early on as compared to other embassies, for instance. Secondly, of course, the debate really for us in the Indian embassy was not the debate that was being faced in either of the two camps of the Cold War. Obviously, the Soviet camp and the Eastern European camp were rooting for the continuation of the system because they were all communist at that time. And the West was rooting for the collapse of the system. And therefore, it is obvious that even their diplomats were ideologically oriented. We had a much more ideological freedom because we were non-aligned. That was our official policy. And therefore, I think the concern in India was whether, having just restored normalcy or normality in our relations with China, because Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had visited just 6 months ago, whether that would still hold, or whether there would be leadership changes, or even possibly a complete catastrophic collapse of the party, which would require us to work the whole situation all over again. Unfortunately, there was very little interest in Indian public opinion about what was happening in China, whether it was our students, whether it was our younger population, or whether it was the senior population. There was really not much interest. There was very little reporting. And therefore, I think the significance of these events just bypassed us at the time. And therefore, I actually wrote the book, although it took me 30 years to do so, because I thought that if we don't, as Indians, know what happened at that time, it becomes difficult to know what is happening in China now. Because as I say, remember, it is the same political party.
So the next question is about this entire visit of Mikhail Gorshov's visit when he visited and there was the protest still going on. So it's in two parts. One, why did the party actually wait for 45 days to actually take action and not disperse the crowd before? And the second part is, how did that the Sino-Soviet summit that happened probably 30 years post, and there was a sign of actually having a bond with the Soviet, and there was a major embarrassment for the Chinese that time because they couldn't control the crowd there. So how did that add to the fire later on?
Well, initially the delay was because of, as I said, because there was a division within the party, a divide within the party on how to handle it. The hardline element felt that this must be immediately crushed. But the General Secretary Chao Ziyang and his supporters felt that it needed to be handled in a more delicate way. However, neither had any altruistic motives. Both were looking to gain power. And one felt that their position would be consolidated by a hardline response. Another faction felt that a slightly softer response might get them power. So the initial delay was very much because the party itself could not decide on the course of action. Although they all understood that this was a problem. Subsequently, I think the Gorbachev visit complicated matters because after 30 years, the Chinese were going to normalize relations with the second major superpower in the world. They had already done this with the Americans 10 years earlier. And finally, the Chinese felt they were going to have normal relations with both superpowers. Now, this was a situation they had never encountered since 1949, because either there had been, the Americans had put pressure on them, military and otherwise, or the Soviet Union had put pressure on them. So for them, this was a crowning achievement. The fact that the Soviet president was coming to China. And he did not want anything to detract from this. Now, accordingly, down the line, nobody else either wanted to take any action which would, in a sense, pour cold water on the idea, or as the Americans say, which would rain on Dunn's parade. And therefore, there was a paralysis in the system. A paralysis born of the fact that nobody wanted to do something which might subsequently bring Deng Xiaoping's anger onto her or him, saying, well, this visit was disrupted because you did something. As a result, that paralysis persisted until Gorbachev left. Now, of course, the fact that was they did try to diffuse the situation around the 11th or 12th of May. Gorbachev came on the 13th. They tried to diffuse the situation. Unfortunately, there was no meeting ground between the students in the square and the government. And therefore, the unfortunate situation occurred where they couldn't even give a proper official welcome to Gorbachev in Tiananmen Square. But once, of course, Gorbachev had gone, the party quickly united. They had resolved internal problems. They had decided that the General Secretary must be sacked. And as you see, within 5 days, they declared martial law and they brought the situation under control. So I think that really was the sequence of events.
Yeah. And since you mentioned that the martial law was imposed, the Western media actually framed the martial law was imposed. There were tanks, there was rifles, and a lot of people, there were shootings and a lot of people lost their life. Whereas in the book, you mentioned this very important thing, and I want to ask you on that in the square, there was no massacre. Tell us.
Yes, so I'm glad you brought up that point, because I am not suggesting that there were no killings in Beijing. I am simply addressing the limited point that in Tiananmen Square, and this is a very specific geographic area defined in Beijing. If you ever visit Beijing or any of your listeners visit Beijing, it is a very defined square framed by the forbidden, the imperial palace at one end, the front gate of the palace at the other, and on the two sides are two big government buildings. One is their parliament and the other is their history museum. And Mao Zedong's mausoleum is in the center. So it's a very specific geographic area. Now, the point I was making was that this was the area which the students had literally captured for the last 40 days of protests. And in this particular area, there were probably no deaths. And if there were, they were in the low single digits, in my opinion. And the reason I say this is twofold. One, because adequate warnings had already been given by the government to the students over a period of days. And even when we visited the square a few days before, we had found the numbers had already dropped sharply. It was only the extremely radical students who still remained in the square. The rest of them, whether they were disappointed with the government's approach or not, had quietly gone back to their universities. The second is, there are student accounts by the students themselves who were in the square, that around 3 o'clock on the night of 3rd, 4th June, they vacated the square after they tried unsuccessfully to persuade the Chinese forces not to take action. And the Chinese forces told them that, well, we are compelled to do so if you don't move out. So I took at face value accounts that students themselves put out, and many of these students were subsequently exiled in the United States. Therefore, there was no reason for them to lie. It is not as if the Chinese government was putting pressure on them to lie. Now, this, of course, and I do appreciate that the book should have made it clearer that there were, however, casualties and fatalities elsewhere in the city. But I also want to point out that these fatalities were not unidirectional. In other words, it was not as if these were all students or civilians being mowed down by the Chinese army. For instance, there was I was eyewitness to an attack by the civilians on a Chinese armored personnel carrier, which was moving through the city right in front of my house, where they pulled out the soldiers and beat them. Now, you will agree that any security force, when it is threatened in this manner, tends to retaliate. That's not just the case with authoritarian governments. Even in democracies, you can't attack the law without having a response. Otherwise, there would be lawlessness. So my point is that as of now, there is no clear confirmed numbers of the dead, because the Chinese have not put it out and nobody else is in a position to count. And there is also need for a more nuanced understanding that while the Chinese People's Liberation Army did fire on students in some areas, particularly near the university and near some critical junctions and entry points to the square, it is also likely that there were fatalities provoked by action that the civilians first took against the security forces. The point I'm trying to make is, of course, there was a tragedy, but we need not simply accept the Western version of that tragedy. We need to find the facts and to take a more balanced approach. And I will mention as the last point that the fact that martial law was declared on the 20th of May and action was only taken on the early morning of the 4th of June, which is about 2 weeks, suggests that the Chinese government also made efforts to minimize violence and casualties. And perhaps the leadership decided by the 2nd or 3rd of June that they had no other option, that the few remaining radicalized students in the square were simply not amenable to reason.
Yeah. So a couple of last questions I have. So one, I want to talk a little bit about thing which you have not explicitly mentioned in the book, and that's the reason I want to bring this conversation. The rest is, of course, the readers can go back and read, so that we have enticed them enough to read the books. Now it's up to them to go and read. And I'm sure they will pick up a copy. So a lot has not been said about what's the long-term implication and the relevance of the Tiananmen Square. I want to talk 2 points. One, about the hyper-nationalism that arose that time and it's relevant today, and the creation of the party elites that time, it's still relevant today. If you could just talk a little bit about these two.
Yeah, so both are very, very relevant. But on the nationalism issue, very briefly, essentially when China moved finally onto the path of reform, after the Tiananmen Square incident was over and all the political questions were resolved within the party, this essentially meant moving away from what was socialist or communist thought. So, in other words, leaders like Deng Xiaoping began to say it is okay if some people get rich first, if some parts of China progress before other parts of China, or that it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white or yellow, so long as it catches the mice. In a sense, these were all statements which were intended to make the Chinese accept an unequal society. In other words, there were going to be differentiations in income, in wealth, in status, and so on as a result of this. Now, what resulted, of course, as a consequence of this was the party by the end of the 90s wasn't communist in the typical way that we understand communism or socialism. It was, in a sense, a party which was sponsoring state capitalism. Now, they needed another set of ideas or ideologies, whatever you may wish to call it, to gain legitimacy. And one of these was nationalism. In other words, the party would argue that they were in the best position to ensure that the Chinese population and the public and the country were never again humiliated in the way that they were first under the Western rule or partial rule, and then subsequently during the Civil War. So that was the nationalism part of it. And that is very much reflected even today. And the second is the elites. And there I think we must not be caught up in the imagination or belief that this is an egalitarian society where everyone can rise up the power structure. China, in fact, is very, very oligarchic. Those who fought for the revolution are considered better than others, and their children and grandchildren continue to benefit from that, whether it is in terms of politics, whether in terms of business, or in terms of any other aspect of life. And no better example than Xi Jinping, because he himself is the son of one of the top Chinese leaders who was one of Mao Zedong's collaborators during the 1940s, 30s, 40s, and 1950s. So there is a sense of entitlement. And these people, therefore, very easily rise to the top rungs of business, of government, of the media, and so on and so forth. Therefore, those of us in India who have this starry-eyed notion that a socialistic or communistic form of government might actually bring about a fairer distribution of wealth or power, ought to study China, or in fact even the erstwhile Soviet Union for that matter, but now China is the only so-called living example, to recognize that it operates like all polities, and irrespective of whether we consider them as monarchies, democracies, dictatorships, or by any other name, ultimately politics is politics.
Yeah. So before I let you go, the final question is, you mentioned in the book as well that the official narrative that the Chinese were there mentioned throughout this Tiananmen Square was actually they were black hands to overthrow the communist government, whereas the Westerners had this view that it was a democratic upsurge. But India had no. What was India's take in that? What did India benefit from Tiananmen Square, except probably a few years of relatively calm at the borders? There was no probably incursions because it was more involved in domestic politics. So what was India's take in all of this?
Well, I think that the point you made is an important point. That after 1990, because of their suspicions of West and of the Western intentions with regard to the Communist Party of China, there was a period when relations with India were sought to be improved. And one of the questions that has always been debated since is whether we took advantage of the opportunity or not. But that's a separate debate, and obviously I didn't write about it or touch about it in my book. Now, beyond that, because as I said, there was no interest in Indian public opinion, and ultimately in a democracy, it is public opinion that drives the politics of the government. Because there was no interest in public opinion, and because Government of India's official policy was that we do not interfere in the internal affairs of others, and we don't expect others to interfere in our internal affairs, there was really no other advantage you could take of the situation. It is not as if we wanted to take advantage because we had either helped them put down the revolt, or if the revolt had happened, we had supported the movement. And therefore, we were in a sense a sort of almost like a neutral observer. You know, somebody standing on the side of the road watching a fight between two people, but with no skin in the fight. You know, we were just watching and maybe taking pleasure from it or having fun. And that was it. But I think that last point was that perhaps we could have taken a better use of the opportunity that was given to us. Because for a certain period of time, the Chinese felt nervous enough to want to improve relations with the non-West, as I call it, those which were not part of the West.
So, well, thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and being on the show. It's an honor and a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
And I think we covered the book pretty much, and the rest of it to the audience. Actually, I do suggest them to go and pick up a copy. It's a very fascinating read, and I'll put the link in the description for them to go and buy the copy.